The frigid waters of the Snake River roared with unforgiving fury as Belinda Tucker gripped the reins of her panicked mare. The spring flood of 1878 having transformed the normally manageable crossing into a death trap. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the powerful current swept her horse's hooves from beneath it, sending both rider and mount tumbling into the churning waters that had already claimed 3 lives that season in the Wyoming Territory. Xavier Blackett had been tracking a small herd of wild mustangs along the riverbank when he spotted the woman's desperate attempt to ford the swollen river. He'd watched in horror as she disappeared beneath the surface, her chestnut mare struggling against the current before breaking free and scrambling toward the shore. Without hesitation, Xavier spurred his stallion along the bank, keeping pace with where he'd last seen the woman's head disappear beneath the churning water. "Hold on," he shouted uselessly over the roar of the flood, stripping off his leather vest and gun belt as he ran. The cold spring air bit at his skin as he plunged into the icy river, the shock of it stealing his breath before his years of swimming in mountain lakes took over. Belinda fought against the panic threatening to overwhelm her as her heavy skirts dragged her down. The river tumbled her mercilessly, disorienting her until she couldn't tell which way was up. Her lungs screamed for air as she clawed desperately at the water, her vision darkening around the edges when suddenly a strong arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her upward until her face broke the surface. "Breathe," a deep voice commanded in her ear as she gasped and coughed, water spewing from her mouth as her rescuer fought the current, pulling them both toward the shore with powerful strokes of his free arm. Xavier's muscles burned with the effort of fighting the river while keeping the woman's head above water. She was slight in his arms, but her water-soaked clothing added tremendous weight as he kicked toward the bank where his horse waited, pawing nervously at the ground. When his boots finally scraped against the rocky riverbed, Xavier stood, hauling the half-conscious woman against his chest as he staggered toward dry land. Her face was pale beneath her sodden dark hair, her lips tinged blue from the cold. "Stay with me, madam," he urged, laying her gently on the grassy bank before quickly gathering kindling for a fire. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he struck his flint, nurturing the small flame to life while keeping an eye on the shivering woman. Belinda's consciousness returned fully with the violent shudders that racked her body. The sensation of drowning still clung to her, making each breath seem precious as she blinked water from her eyes, focusing on the lean figure crouched before a small but growing fire. My horse," she managed through chattering teeth. "She made it across downstream," the man replied, his voice low and steady as he added larger branches to the flames. "Tough little mare, much like her rider, I'd say." He turned toward her then, and Belinda found herself looking into eyes the color of a summer storm set in a face weathered by sun and wind. "Thank you," she whispered, attempting to sit up. "You saved my life, Mr. Blackett, Xavier Blackett." He moved to her side, supporting her back as she straightened. "And you're mighty welcome, though I'd advise against trying that crossing again until summer. The snakes claimed enough lives this spring." "Belinda Tucker," she replied, extending a trembling hand that he enveloped in his much larger one. "I was trying to reach Leavenworth. My uncle has a ranch outside town." Xavier's brow furrowed. "Leavenworth's in Kansas, madam. You're in Wyoming Territory. And a good 400 miles from where you're aiming." The shock on her face might have been comical under different circumstances. "Wyoming," but the stagecoach driver said. Her voice trailed off as comprehension dawned. "He wasn't a driver at all, was he? Just another swindler selling false directions." Xavier nodded grimly. "Happens more often than it should. Where were you coming from?" "St. Louis," Belinda replied, pulling her sodden shawl tighter around her shoulders. After my father died, I discovered that my mother's brother had written to him years ago, offering me a place if I ever needed one. I had nowhere else to go. The cowboy nodded, standing to retrieve a blanket from his saddlebags. Well, Miss Tucker, seems like you've had more than your share of troubles. Nearest town is Willow Creek, about 15 miles east of here. I've got a small cabin another 5 miles beyond that where you can dry out proper before figuring your next move. Belinda hesitated, eyeing the stranger cautiously. Handsome as he might be, with his dark hair curling damply against his forehead and strong, capable hands, she wasn't naive enough to trust a man she'd just met, no matter that he'd saved her life. Xavier seemed to read her thoughts. You've no reason to trust me. I understand that. But night's coming. Temperatures drop fast in these parts, and those wet clothes will be the death of you. I give you my word as a gentleman that my only intention is to see you safe. The sincerity in his eyes and the stark reality of her situation left Belinda little choice. She nodded slowly. Thank you, Mr. Blackett. I accept your offer. Xavier, he corrected with a small smile that transformed his serious face. Anyone I've pulled from a river gets to use my given name. Despite everything, Belinda found herself returning his smile. Xavier, then, and you must call me Belinda. They remained by the fire until Belinda had stopped shivering. Then Xavier helped her mount his stallion while he walked alongside, leading the horse carefully along the rugged trail. The spring twilight deepened around them, the mountains to the west turning purple against the darkening sky. You're a long way from anywhere, Belinda observed, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. What brings you to such a remote spot? Xavier glanced up at her, his face partially shadowed by his hat. The mustangs. I catch and break them, sell some, keep others. It's a good life for a man who prefers his own company. And do you prefer your own company? He considered this for a moment before answering. Most days. Towns tend to get crowded with folks wanting things from you. Out here, it's simpler. Yet you didn't hesitate to complicate your life by jumping into a flooded river after a stranger, Belinda pointed out. Xavier's mouth quirked upward. Some complications are worth the trouble, Miss Tucker. The last of the daylight had faded by the time they reached Xavier's cabin, a solid structure nestled against a stand of pines with a small corral nearby where several horses raised their heads at their approach. Xavier helped Belinda dismount, her legs nearly buckling beneath her after the journey. Easy there, he murmured, supporting her with an arm around her waist as he guided her to the cabin door. Inside, the single room was Spartan but neat, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall, a narrow bed in the corner, and a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs positioned beneath the cabin's only window. Xavier quickly kindled a fire, the warmth flooding the small space as he moved to a trunk at the foot of the bed. These will swim on you, he said, withdrawing a flannel shirt and wool trousers, but they're dry. I'll tend to the horses while you change. Belinda clutched the offered clothing, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of her situation, stranded in Wyoming territory, hundreds of miles from her destination, in the cabin of a man she'd known for mere hours. Yet something about Xavier Blackett's steady presence calmed her fears. Thank you, she said simply, waiting until the door closed behind him before peeling off her sodden clothing. The flannel shirt was indeed enormous on her small frame, the sleeves extending well past her fingertips, but the blessed dryness and warmth made the ill fit irrelevant. Outside, Xavier unsaddled his stallion, his mind turning over the unexpected events of the day. The woman's appearance had thrown his carefully ordered life into disarray, yet he couldn't regret his impulsive dive into the river. There was something about Belinda Tucker, a quiet strength beneath her proper exterior, that intrigued him more than he cared to admit. When he returned to the cabin, he found her seated by the fire, her dark hair loose around her shoulders as she attempted to dry it with a corner of the blanket she'd wrapped around herself. She'd rolled up the sleeves of his shirt and tied the trousers with what appeared to be a length of cord, the result oddly endearing. "There's food in that cupboard," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Nothing fancy, but it'll fill the empty spaces." Belinda rose, moving to the indicated cupboard where she found dried beans, jerky, and a small sack of cornmeal. "I can make a decent stew if you have a pot," she offered, grateful for the chance to be useful. They worked together in comfortable silence, Xavier fetching water from the spring behind the cabin while Belinda prepared the simple meal. The domesticity of the scene struck her as they sat across from each other at the small table, steam rising from their bowls as the fire crackled in the hearth. "Tomorrow I'll take you to Willow Creek," Xavier said as they ate. "The general store carries some women's things, and there's a boarding house where you can stay until you sort out your plans." Belinda nodded, though the thought of parting from her rescuer brought an unexpected pang of regret. "I don't have much money," she admitted. "What I had was in my saddlebags. You're more likely headed for the nearest settlement. Horses are smarter than people give them credit for. We'll ask around Willow Creek, someone might have spotted her." "And if not," Xavier shrugged, "then we'll figure something else out. Wyoming Territory's not the genteel society you're used to, but folks look out for each other here." After their meal, Xavier insisted Belinda take the bed while he spread his bedroll before the fire. She protested weakly, but exhaustion from her ordeal soon overcame her, and she fell into a deep sleep, the steady sound of Xavier's breathing a strange comfort in the unfamiliar darkness. Morning arrived with pale golden light filtering through the cabin window. Belinda woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting her circumstances, until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up to find the cabin empty, though the fire had been built up, and a mug of steaming coffee waited on the table beside a note scratched on a scrap of paper. "Gone to check traps. Back soon." Outside, the world appeared transformed in the clear morning light. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by pine forest, with mountains rising in the distance and a stream bubbling nearby. Despite her predicament, Belinda couldn't help but appreciate the wild beauty of the place. She was attempting to tame her tangled hair with her fingers when Xavier returned, carrying a pair of rabbits for their breakfast. He paused in the doorway, struck by the sight of her silhouetted against the window, her hair catching the sunlight. "Good morning," she said, turning at his entrance. "I hope you don't mind, but I helped myself to the coffee." "My casa es su casa," he replied with a small smile, moving to the rough wooden counter to prepare the rabbits. "Sleep well. Better than I had any right to, considering everything. Thank you again for your kindness." Xavier shook his head. "No need to keep thanking me. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Belinda said softly. "Not anyone would have risked their life for a stranger. I'm alive because of you, Xavier Blackett, and I won't forget it." Their eyes met across the small space, something unspoken passing between them before Xavier cleared his throat and returned his attention to the rabbits. "We should reach Willow Creek by midday if we start soon." The journey to town was made mostly in silence, Belinda again riding Xavier's stallion while he walked beside her, leading the way along the narrow trail that wound through stands of pine and across open meadows, where spring wildflowers had begun to bloom. Willow Creek proved to be little more than a cluster of wooden buildings straddling the stagecoach route, a general store, saloon, blacksmith shop, and the boarding house Xavier had mentioned, run by a widow named Mrs. Peterson. "Brought you a guest, Lisa," Xavier called as they entered the tidy front parlor where a gray-haired woman sat mending by the window. "Mrs. Peterson peered at them over her spectacles, her gaze lingering curiously on Belinda's oversized borrowed clothing before shifting to Xavier with raised eyebrows. "Miss Tucker had an unfortunate encounter with the Snake River yesterday," Xavier explained. "Lost her horse and belongings. She's looking for temporary accommodations while sorting out her situation." "Well now, that is a predicament," Mrs. Peterson said, setting aside her mending to approach Belinda. "You poor dear. Of course you can stay here. We'll get you settled with proper clothing and anything else you need." Relief washed over Belinda. "Thank you, Mrs. Peterson. I'm afraid I have little money, but I'm a hard worker and would gladly earn my keep." The older woman waved away her concern. "We'll work something out. Now, Xavier Blackett, you go see about finding the young lady's horse while I take care of getting her properly attired. A woman can't be expected to go around in men's clothing, no matter how dire the circumstances." Xavier tipped his hat, his eyes meeting Belinda's briefly. "I'll be back before sundown to check on you." After he'd gone, Mrs. Peterson led Belinda to a small but clean room on the second floor. "Now, tell me everything," she said, sitting Belinda down on the edge of the narrow bed. "And don't leave out a detail about how you came to be wearing Xavier Blackett's clothing." By the time Belinda had bathed in the tin tub, Mrs. Peterson provided and changed into a borrowed dress that, while plain, fit her far better than Xavier's clothes. Word of her river rescue had spread through Willow Creek. Several townswomen stopped by with offerings: a hairbrush, a shawl, a pair of barely worn boots that pinched only slightly at the toes. "Word travels fast in small towns," Mrs. Peterson explained as she helped Belinda arrange her hair. "Especially when it involves Xavier Blackett doing something social. That man keeps to himself more than is natural, if you ask me." "He mentioned breaking horses," Belinda said, curious about her rescuer. "Is that his livelihood?" "Part of it. He's got a way with animals that borders on uncanny. Supplies the army with some of the finest mounts in the territory, but there's more to him than he lets on." Mrs. Peterson's voice dropped conspiratorially. "Came out here 5 years ago from Boston, if you can believe it. Educated man, you can hear it in how he talks when he forgets to play the simple cowboy." Belinda thought of Xavier's formal manners and careful speech, at odds with his rough appearance. "Why would someone leave Boston for the wilderness?" Mrs. Peterson shrugged. "That's the mystery, isn't it? Some say he was running from the law. Others claim it was a woman who broke his heart. Whatever the reason, he keeps his past to himself, and most folks respect that. Wyoming territory attracts those looking to start fresh." Late afternoon brought Xavier back to the boarding house, his stallion accompanied by a familiar chestnut mare. Belinda rushed outside at Mrs. Peterson's call, her heart leaping at the sight of her horse. "Maple," she exclaimed, hurrying forward to stroke the mare's velvety nose. "Where did you find her?" "Wandering near Miller's farm, about 3 miles downriver," Xavier replied, a smile warming his usually serious face. "Your saddlebags are still attached, though I can't vouch for the condition of what's inside." Belinda opened the leather pouches with trembling fingers, relieved to find that while her spare clothing was damp, the oilskin pouch containing her money and her father's pocket watch remained dry. "This is wonderful news," she said, beaming up at Xavier. "I can pay Mrs. Peterson and perhaps purchase passage to Kansas." Something flickered across Xavier's face, disappointment perhaps, before he nodded. "The stagecoach comes through on Tuesdays and Fridays. Today's Wednesday, so you've got some time to rest and prepare. Mrs. Peterson appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Xavier Blackett, you'll stay for supper. I've made enough for an army, and that poor girl needs to keep up her strength after nearly drowning." The meal was a lively affair with Mrs. Peterson's other boarders, a young schoolteacher named Miss Winters, and an elderly prospector called Old Pete joining them at the long table in the dining room. Belinda found herself seated beside Xavier, acutely aware of his presence as he conversed easily with the others, revealing a dry wit that surprised her. Miss Tucker was headed for Leavenworth, Xavier mentioned as they enjoyed apple pie for dessert. "Her uncle has a ranch there." "Leavenworth, Kansas," Old Pete wheezed, scratching his white beard. "I passed through there years back. Fine cattle country, but a far piece from here." "Is there a direct stage route?" Belinda asked hopefully. Miss Winters shook her head. "You'd need to take the stage to Cheyenne, then catch the Union Pacific east to Kansas City, and another stage south to Leavenworth. It's quite an undertaking." "And expensive," Mrs. Peterson added. "Stage fare to Cheyenne alone would set you back a pretty penny, not to mention the train ticket." Belinda's heart sank as she mentally counted the money in her pouch. Even with the return of her savings, she doubted she had enough for such a journey. "Perhaps I could find work here until I can save enough," she suggested. "What skills do you have?" Miss Winters inquired politely. "I was a teacher in St. Louis," Belinda replied. "Reading, writing, arithmetic, some history and literature." "Well now," the schoolteacher said, her face brightening. "That is fortunate timing. I'm to be married next month and had given notice at the school. The town council has been searching for a replacement. It doesn't pay much," Mrs. Peterson warned, "but it includes a small room at the schoolhouse and would give you time to save for your journey." Xavier, who had been silent during this exchange, finally spoke. "It's a sensible plan. Willow Creek's a decent place to wait out your circumstances." His apparent ease with the idea of her staying in town both pleased and confused Belinda. Did he want her to remain, or was he simply being practical about her limited options? After supper, Xavier walked Belinda to the small stable behind the boarding house where Maple had been settled for the night. The evening air was cool, stars beginning to appear in the deepening blue sky above them. "Thank you again for finding her," Belinda said, stroking the mare's neck. "She was my father's favorite. I couldn't bear to sell her, even when things were at their worst after his death." "She's a fine animal," Xavier agreed, leaning against the stable door. "Loyal, too, from the way she greeted you." Belinda turned to face him fully. "You've been more than kind to me, Xavier. I wish there was some way I could repay you." "Seeing you safe is payment enough," he replied, his voice softer than usual. "Though I admit, I find myself glad that your journey to Kansas may be delayed." The admission hung between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Belinda felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with her recent ordeal. Perhaps you could show me more of this territory while I'm here. I've never been west of the Mississippi before yesterday." Xavier's smile was slow and genuine. "I'd like that very much, Belinda Tucker." They stood for a moment longer in the growing darkness, neither willing to break the fragile connection between them, until Mrs. Peterson's voice called from the house, reminding Belinda that she was still recovering from her ordeal and needed rest. "Good night, Xavier," she said softly. "Good night, Belinda," he replied, tipping his hat before turning to walk toward the livery where he'd arranged to board his stallion for the night. The following week saw Belinda settling into life in Willow Creek with surprising ease. The town council, desperate for a teacher, hired her immediately upon Miss Winters' recommendation. The schoolhouse was a simple one-room building with a small attached living space that, while basic, provided Belinda with independence she hadn't expected to find so quickly. Her days fell into a pleasant rhythm, teaching the town's dozen or so children during the day, preparing lessons in the evening, and attending church on Sundays, where she was gradually accepted into the close-knit community. Xavier, true to his word, began showing her the surrounding countryside during her free time, their rides together becoming the highlight of her week. They explored hidden valleys where wildflowers carpeted the ground in brilliant colors, climbed to rocky outcroppings that offered breathtaking views of the distant mountains, and picnicked beside clear streams where Xavier taught her to fish for trout. During these excursions, Belinda learned more about her taciturn rescuer than she suspected most townspeople knew. "My father was a banker," Xavier confided one afternoon as they rested beneath the spreading branches of a cottonwood tree. "He had my life planned from the moment I was born: Harvard, then the family business, marriage to the daughter of one of his associates." "And you wanted something different?" Belinda prompted when he fell silent. Xavier nodded, his eyes on the distant horizon. "I wanted to see what lay beyond Boston's brick walls. When my father died suddenly of apoplexy, I discovered he'd been embezzling from his clients for years. The scandal would have destroyed what remained of our family name. So you came west to escape it." "I came west to find something honest," he corrected. "My father lived his entire life pretending to be something he wasn't. Out here, a man is judged by his actions, not his family connections or the cut of his coat." Belinda considered this. "Is that why you prefer the solitude of your cabin?" "To avoid judgment altogether." Xavier's gaze shifted to her face, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps at first. Now I'm not so sure that solitude is what I want." The implication of his words sent warmth spreading through Belinda's chest. Over the weeks, their companionship had developed into something deeper, though neither had put voice to the changing nature of their relationship. June brought the end of the school term, and with it, Miss Winter's wedding, a joyful community affair that left Belinda contemplating her own future. She had saved nearly enough for the journey to Leavenworth, yet found herself increasingly reluctant to leave Willow Creek and the life she'd begun to build there. The wedding celebration continued into the evening, with tables set up outside the church and lanterns strung between the trees. As fiddle music filled the air, couples began to dance on the packed earth of the churchyard. "May I have this dance, Miss Tucker?" Xavier appeared at her side, looking uncommonly formal in a clean white shirt and dark vest. Belinda smiled up at him, placing her hand in his outstretched one. "I thought you didn't care for crowds, Mr. Blackett." "Some company is worth enduring crowds for," he replied, leading her to join the other dancers. His arm around her waist was strong and sure as they moved together to the lively music. Belinda was acutely aware of the warmth of his hand against hers, the subtle scent of pine and leather that seemed to cling to him. "I received a letter yesterday," she said as they circled with the other dancers, "from my uncle in Leavenworth. He confirmed that I'm welcome at his ranch whenever I arrive." Xavier's steps faltered slightly before he recovered. "I see. Have you decided when you'll be leaving?" The pain in his eyes made Belinda's heart constrict. "I haven't replied yet. The truth is, Xavier, I'm not sure I want to go to Kansas anymore." The dance ended, but neither moved to separate. Around them, other couples drifted away as a slower tune began, but Xavier kept his arm around Belinda's waist. "What's keeping you in Wyoming territory?" he asked, his voice low and intent. Belinda met his gaze steadily. "I think you know the answer to that." The kiss, when it came, was gentle yet filled with a longing that left Belinda breathless. Xavier's hand cradled her face as if she were something precious, his touch reverent in the gathering twilight. "I've wanted to do that since I pulled you from the river," he confessed when they finally parted, his forehead resting against hers. What took you so long?" She whispered, her hands resting against the solid warmth of his chest. Xavier chuckled, the sound rich with happiness. "I was waiting for you to decide if you were staying or going. I wouldn't presume to influence such an important decision. And now that I've decided—" "Now," he said, brushing a tendril of hair from her face, "I'd like to court you properly, Belinda Tucker, if you'll allow it." Her answer was another kiss, heedless of the knowing smiles and whispers from the townspeople around them. The summer passed in a golden haze of happiness for Belinda. Xavier began spending more time in town, taking odd jobs at the livery stable or helping with barn raisings and fence mending to be near her. Their courtship progressed with a sweet intensity that surprised them. Both neither had expected to find love in such unlikely circumstances. In late August, as the first hints of autumn touched the aspen leaves with gold, Xavier took Belinda on a ride to his cabin. He'd been spending more time there recently, often leaving town for days at a time without explanation, returning tired but strangely satisfied. "I have something to show you," he said as they approached the clearing. Belinda gasped at the transformation before her. What had once been a sparse bachelor's cabin now boasted a covered porch, window boxes filled with late-blooming wildflowers, and a second structure taking shape nearby. "Xavier, what is all this?" He helped her dismount, his expression a mixture of pride and nervousness. "I've been expanding. The second building will be a proper schoolhouse large enough for a dozen students." "A schoolhouse? But why? Some of the ranching families in the area can't send their children all the way to Willow Creek," he explained. "They've asked if a teacher might be willing to come to them instead." Understanding dawned on Belinda's face. "You did this for me." Xavier took her hands in his. "I did it for us. I know my cabin is remote and I'd never ask you to give up teaching. This way you could continue your profession while we—" He hesitated, then dropped to one knee before her, producing a simple gold band from his pocket. "Belinda Tucker, you fell into my life like a miracle I never knew to ask for. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears blurred Belinda's vision as she nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. Xavier slipped the ring onto her finger before standing to gather her in his arms, his kiss conveying all the love words couldn't express. They were married in October, when the mountains were ablaze with autumn colors. The entire population of Willow Creek made the journey to Xavier's now their cabin for the ceremony, performed by the traveling preacher who served the remote settlements. Belinda wore a dress of pale blue silk that Mrs. Peterson had helped her sew, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Xavier, standing tall and proud beside Reverend Johnson, couldn't take his eyes off his bride as she walked toward him on old Pete's arm, the elderly prospector having volunteered to give her away. "Dearly beloved," the preacher began, his voice carrying across the clearing where chairs had been arranged in neat rows. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Xavier Blackett and Belinda Tucker in holy matrimony." The celebration afterward lasted well into the night, with dancing by lantern light and enough food to feed an army, contributed by every family in attendance. As the last guests departed, Xavier led his new wife into their home, now furnished with curtains at the windows and a larger bed built by Xavier's own hands. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackett," he said softly, closing the door behind them. Belinda turned in a slow circle, taking in the cabin that would now be their home. "It's perfect," she whispered, meaning not just the physical space but everything their life together represented. Their wedding night was a tender discovery of each other. Xavier's touch gentle and reverent as they consummated their marriage beneath the quilt Belinda had pieced together during the weeks of their engagement. Afterward, Lying in each other's arms with the sound of the wind in the pines outside their window, Belinda marveled at the journey that had brought her here. "I was so frightened that day in the river," she murmured against Xavier's chest. "I thought it was the end, but it was really the beginning." His arms tightened around her. "I thank God every day that I was there to pull you out." Winter settled over the mountains with a fierce beauty, snow transforming the landscape into a glittering wonderland. Xavier completed the schoolhouse before the heaviest snows came, and by January, Belinda had 5 students' children from the scattered ranches within riding distance who arrived on horseback each morning, stamping snow from their boots before settling at the desks Xavier had crafted. Their life together fell into a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the land. Xavier continued breaking horses, his reputation spreading until ranchers from as far away as Montana were sending animals to him. Belinda's school thrived, her students showing remarkable progress under her patient guidance. Spring's arrival brought with it unexpected news that filled their cabin with joy. Belinda was expecting their first child, due in the late autumn. Xavier's reaction to the announcement was to lift her off her feet in a careful embrace, his face alight with wonder as he placed a gentle hand over her still flat stomach. "A child," he breathed. "Our child. Are you pleased?" Belinda asked, though his radiant expression answered her question. "More than I can say," he replied, kissing her tenderly. "Though you'll have to rest more. No more fording rivers in your condition." Belinda laughed, leaning into his embrace. "I think one near-drowning experience in a lifetime is quite enough, thank you." As her pregnancy progressed, Xavier became increasingly protective, insisting on accompanying her to and from the schoolhouse and taking over more of the household chores. Belinda accepted his concern with good grace, recognizing it as an expression of his love. In late September, just as the aspen leaves were beginning to turn, Belinda went into labor. Mrs. Peterson, who had come to stay with them for the final weeks of the pregnancy, sent Xavier from the cabin with firm instructions not to return until called, an order he obeyed with obvious reluctance. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and as the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky, their son was born a robust boy with his father's storm-gray eyes and a shock of dark hair. "You can come in now," Mrs. Peterson called to Xavier, who had been pacing outside for hours. He entered cautiously, his eyes immediately finding Belinda propped up in their bed, a small bundle cradled in her arms. The expression on his face as he approached was one of such naked emotion that tears sprang to Belinda's eyes. "Meet your son," she said softly, shifting the blanket to reveal the newborn's face. Xavier sat carefully on the edge of the bed, reaching out with trembling fingers to touch the baby's cheek. "He's perfect," he whispered, his voice choked. "Just like his mother. What shall we call him?" Belinda asked, leaning against Xavier's shoulder as they gazed down at their child. Xavier considered for a moment. "James," he suggested. "After my grandfather. He was the one who taught me to ride and fish, all the things I love most about this life." "James Blackett," Belinda tested the name, smiling as the baby's tiny hand curled around her finger. "It suits him." Mrs. Peterson discreetly left the new family alone, closing the cabin door behind her. In the quiet that followed, Xavier stretched out beside Belinda on the bed, his arm around her shoulders and their son between them. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair, "for our son, for choosing to stay, for everything." Belinda turned her face up to his. "I never wrote to my uncle to tell him I wasn't coming," she confessed. "I should probably do that," Xavier chuckled. "Perhaps invite him to visit instead. He might like to meet his great-nephew. And see that I found everything I was looking for, though not where I expected to find it." As if in agreement, little James made a small sound, his eyes opening briefly before closing again in sleep. Outside their window, the morning sun illuminated the mountains, the same river that had nearly claimed Belinda's life now a silver ribbon in the distance. "I love you, Belinda Blackett," Xavier said, the name still new and wonderful on his tongue. "And I love you," she replied, settling deeper into his embrace. "My cowboy, my rescuer, my heart." The years that followed brought changes and growth to the Blackett family. James was joined by a sister, Elizabeth, 2 years later, and another brother, Samuel, 2 years after that. The schoolhouse expanded to accommodate more students as word of Belinda's teaching abilities spread throughout the region. Xavier's horse business flourished, allowing them to build a larger home adjacent to the original cabin, which became Xavier's office and tack room. Their ranch, which they named River's Edge in commemoration of their first meeting, became known throughout the territory for its fine horses and warm hospitality. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Belinda with a journey not to Leavenworth, which they had visited twice to meet her uncle, but to Boston, where Xavier faced the ghosts of his past with Belinda by his side. They returned to Wyoming more certain than ever that they had found their true home. Life in the West remained challenging. Droughts, harsh winters, and occasional conflicts with those who resented the settling of the frontier tested their resilience. Yet through it all, Xavier and Belinda's love remained their anchor, as steady and powerful as the current that had once threatened to separate them forever. In the spring of 1903, 25 years after Xavier had pulled Belinda from the flooded Snake River, they stood together on the bank at the spot where their story had begun. Their children were grown now, James running the horse operation alongside his father, Elizabeth teaching in the schoolhouse Belinda had founded, and Samuel studying law in Cheyenne. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been here that day?" Belinda asked, her hand warm in Xavier's as they watched the river flow past, calmer now in its familiar channel. Xavier shook his head, silver threading his once dark hair. "No, some things are meant to be, Belinda. I was meant to be here, you were meant to try that crossing, and I was meant to pull you out so we could build this life together." Belinda leaned against his shoulder, still strong despite the passing years. "A life I wouldn't trade for anything." "Nor would I," Xavier replied, bringing her hand to his lips. "Not one single moment." As they turned to walk back toward their home, where family and friends waited to celebrate their anniversary, Belinda glanced once more at the river that had nearly claimed her life, but had instead given her everything she'd never known to wish for: a love as deep and enduring as the western sky above them, stretching boundless into forever.